Well, in the 1980s, I was a teenager. And we, most of the kids back then, had cars that were from the late 60s to, mid 70s. And the car audio scene did not exist yet. We basically created that at that point. Kicker was introducing, in the mid 80s, they were introducing the butt kicker, and it was actually Stillwater Designs. They were introducing what they called the ass kicker, which was a little box with a passive radiator that you could mount behind the truck seat, because there was nowhere to get any kind of real sound in a pickup truck. It was horrible. Most of the cars back in the 70s, which is the cars again that we were driving in the 80s, came with maybe a speaker in the center of the dash, or sometimes they had two speakers in the dash. But the problem with that was the dash was one solid chunk, and in order to put anything in the dash or take anything out of the dash, you had to go from underneath the dash. So you had to get down on the floor and reach up into the dash with a screwdriver or a wrench, because a lot of times they used little screw studs with little nuts on them. So you had to reach up in there with a wrench and slowly break those little nuts loose and pull those drivers out. Then you had to wiggle it out of there and get it. And then you had to take the new driver and shove it up in there and try to. It was a huge amount of work to change out a speaker back in those days. Of course, back in the back, we had speakers back there too. Sometimes, and the nicer cars had speakers in the back. Yeah, that was a kind of a thing. So the odd thing were there weren't really any door speakers back then. Most speakers were, like I said, buried deep in the dash and required twisting and scraping and contortioning to get those things out of there. So if you had the rear speakers, they were usually 6x9s, since that shape fit the space. And those were our subwoofers back then. Now, on a side note, the guys that are old like me and like rear fill, that's probably where that came from, is the fact that they had speakers back then that were mounted in the back of the car, and so you got used to hearing that sound coming from the front and the rear in the car. Well, since those big old heavy padded dashes were a no-go for most aftermarket speakers, we started getting creative and cutting holes in the doors to put speakers in there, since that was the only real spot to use. On a side note, the metal in those doors was very thick back then, and we really didn't need sound deadener because the metal was just so thick that it deadened itself. And we also had heavy padding on everything, and because crash stuff and comfort and luxury, and we had lots and lots of carpet on everything, so everything was kind of deadened by itself. Later on, the manufacturers would actually start putting speakers in the doors from the factory, and you'll find that in mid 70s and up in some cars and trucks. A lot of pickup trucks had speakers in the doors because the dash was very thin. There was nowhere to put a speaker in the dash. The vertical windshield and the short dash didn't leave much room, and so they would mount those in the doors of the truck. And there was no rear doors to trucks. It was just the front doors, because that was the only doors. And in some cases, they would try to mount speakers in behind the seat because, again, people got used to that sound behind them and they wanted a 4-speaker stereo. So they would put some crappy little speaker back there. It was usually a 3x10, which is a really, really, really flat oval. And they would fit in the B-pillars and stuff behind the seat of the pickup truck. So we were putting stuff back there. Now, here's the thing. Understanding that we didn't have any room to work with, and we were trying to create and fabricate and be inventive about where we would put our speakers. This brought up a whole new market. In the early 80s, it started to bloom. Now, at first, it was really costly to get into, and a lot of these companies that manufactured components for us to use were just starting out, and they were hand building and factory building this stuff. It wasn't as cheap as relative to the cost of living back then. Car stereo equipment was significantly higher. In fact, a lot of it was priced about the same as it is now, with a completely different economy. So that tells a lot about the advancement in manufacturing techniques and how processes have gotten much less expensive over the years. It's also to be noted that if you're the less expensive equipment came from overseas, as it does today. The funny thing is, it mostly came from Japan, and people that wanted to talk crap about your stuff, like today, if it comes from China, it's crap, right? And back then, if it came from Japan, it was crap. And today, we look at Japanese stuff as being some of the highest level quality out there. And it's like, oh man, this is from Japan. This is solid stuff. It's just an interesting side note. Another interesting side note is most of the most popular stuff came from Japan back then, as Marantz, Pioneer, and Sony, and Kenwood, and all of these brands were all Japanese brands. There was very, very little stereo manufacturing coming out of the United States, even back in the 70s and the 80s. It mostly came from Japan because they just knew how to build stuff better and faster. They took a design from the United States and they said, hey, this is pretty good, but we can make it much better, and we can also make it much faster. And that's what they did. And that's how they got into the car market. They were building cars. They were way ahead of the game, building cars that were smaller and more efficient and less expensive, which is what everyone was wanting during those years, because of the gas crisis and the gas prices and all that stuff. So the Japanese were really bringing their A game when it comes to that. But I digress. So we were trying to find places to put speakers, and there was a few different ways you could do this. One of them was to replace the drivers that were in their current position. And in doing that, you had usually 6x9s in the back dash, because that 6x9 shape would fit back there quite nicely, and that would give you an opportunity to put drivers in the factory location. Well, if you wanted tweeters somewhere, if you wanted more sound than just that crappy dual cone that came back there, then you went with a coaxial driver. And of course, we had 2 ways, 3 ways, 4 ways, 5 ways, and they even go up into the 8 and 9 ways, believe it or not. That started a war amongst the manufacturers and the brands who could build the most ways into a coaxial driver. And it got crazy for a minute. But that leads me into the next solution for the problem. And that next solution was using surface mount systems. And what you had was essentially wedge shaped and little pods, and you could mount those in all sorts of places. So all you needed was a flat-ish surface, and you could just put a couple screws in it, screw it right down, hide your wires, run them up front. Bob's your uncle. You had, you could put a speaker where there had been nothing before and not make any major modifications to the vehicle. Of course, this didn't sound that great. It gave you better sound than nothing, but, Another thing we had to figure out back then was how to get power. So, as the car stereos back then, you might have been looking at like 5 watts, per channel, or 3 watts per channel. So it doesn't take a whole lot to improve upon that. Most of your home stereo systems were only running on 5, 6 watts. I mean, it's just a very small amount of power. So that's what they did in cars as well. Well, being teenagers, we wanted everything to be loud, because the louder you are, the cooler you are. And some things never change. Having said that, the options for power were limited. And one of those options was the power booster. The aftermarket world will absolutely provide whenever there's a need, there's greed. So they started dumping lots and lots of power boosters on the market. And a power booster is essentially a small amplifier that doesn't take a lot of power, that cranked it from 3 to 5 watts up to maybe 20 watts output. It introduced a ton of distortion, and they basically sounded like garbage, at least for the most part. But they would also add features like flashing lights, little meters that bounce around, and EQs, and knobs and buttons, and any little feature they could add to make their power booster better than their the competitors. And then, of course, there was also the stereos themselves, because you came with this little square area, and with some buttons, to change your radio station, and a couple of knobs that came out, one on either side. The factory used the shaft style system to actually mount the stereo into the dash. So those 2 shafts that would go through the dash with the knobs on them also had some nuts on there, and they would run that through the sheet metal with the holes, and they would use that to mount the thing. And they also had a bracket on the back. It was usually a spring, a piece of metal with a spring in it, and that would mount to something under the dash, and that would also mount to the back of the radio to keep the thing from bouncing up and down too much and tearing the dash apart. Because these radios weighed like 20 pounds, 10 pounds. They were absolutely gargantuan. And they sucked. So we pulled those out, and of course now you had this square hole with a round hole on either side of it. And the aftermarket world, they introduced radios, of course, that would fit in those factory locations, mostly, usually requiring a little bit of metal massaging, a little bit of sawing, some grinding. We didn't have cordless tools back then, and for the most part, the power tools were kind of, tricky to work with too. So there was no Dremels, there was none of that crap. You had a drill, you had some saws, and basically you had files and all kinds of nasty things that you were trying to do to make this radio fit in this car. It was a huge undertaking. The wiring harness was non-wiring harness. They had wires that ran out of the radio and ran straight into the car, and you had to figure out what wire did what, because there was no color codes, there was no pre-done wiring harnesses and looms that you could just incorporate into it. It was just cut one wire, what does this wire do? Okay, cut this other wire, what does this wire do? You had to figure it out wire by wire by wire, and to get that sorted. It was a lot of work. And of course, if you wanted to put a radio in that did not have that shaft style system, one with lots of features, you had to make a big square hole, and so that you could put this new thing in. And as a side note, a lot of times we would add the radios and equalizers and boosters and tape decks and CDs, and all the other stuff would get added underneath the dash, and creating kind of a component rack mount style system, which consisted of electrical tape, baling wire, and random plumber tape and other stuff to hold that sucker, or just wedging it in there so it didn't move to hold that sucker in place. There was nothing out there to make this right. There was no way to do it right. There was a thing, a square peg that you had to put in a round hole and go for it. You figure it out. So it was really common to do that. The 90s introduced the den and a half and double den stuff, which changed everything and also made it a whole nother layer of complicated. But, so, the interesting thing about the coaxial drivers that we were using is it was a solution for a problem. The problem being there was no space to mount extra speakers, and so you mounted them in the space that you had to work with. And it solved a problem, right? But it's funny how that has never really went away. And the reasoning back then was you got this oval-shaped hole and you want to put multiple speakers in there, so you put them all in that hole. Now we're seeing a different solution for the same tool. As the more you can have your speakers located in the same spot, the better the imaging is going to be. Now the problem with using the old coaxial drivers is they were really cheaply made. They were plastic frame. Everything was just cheap. I mean, it was loud and it gave you a whole lot of hot mess, and it sounded way better than what you had, but it sounded like complete ass compared to what we have today. But the idea of putting the drivers in one location, that's not a bad idea. It never really became a bad idea. It was the execution that was poor. We also used plate mounted stuff back then too, and to where you'd have a 6x9 hole. You would put a plate in there and mount 2 4s or 2 5s, or or a 6 and a tweeter or whatever, and they would mount in that plate. And that was done back then, and it's still being done today. Some things never change. And the reason for that back then was that most of the 6x9 drivers that were available back then were hot garbage. Like I said, it wasn't that the design was bad. It wasn't that the shape of the speaker was a problem. It's that everything available to fit in that space by default was crap. And so if you wanted a high quality driver, you had to make a hole that could fit a driver that you get quality in. So they would use home audio equipment. If you want to use a 6 and a 6x9 hole, you've got to create a plate to be able to put that 6 in there. So you can get better quality equipment to fit in this factory oddball shaped hole. That was the beginning of replacing the 6x9s and the 5x7s with round speakers. It wasn't that the cone sounded better. It's just the equipment that was sounded really good wouldn't fit in that hole. So you had to reshape the space to do it. Coming full circle again, the 6x9s are still around. Now we have zero need for the shape, but that shape has become ambiguous. It is a key shape for car audio, because we had that funny shaped 6x9 back in the day, so it would fit in that back dash, and now we're still using them. Why? Because it's a standard. Like anything else, something becomes a thing, and then that thing is keeps going on, and before long it becomes the standard which everything else is built off of. It's funny how that works. Anyway, I just wanted to pitch out some interesting old school car audio stuff. Talk a little bit about the 70s models cars and what we used to do and how we solved problems back then. And we're still solving them today, but we have different problems today. You know, today we have thinner, lighter metals, thinner materials, and different problems. We have a lot more power available at a lot less price, but I hope you guys enjoyed my video. I was thinking about this one for a while, and I've been working on it for a while, and I figured I'd get it out to you guys and let y'all relive some of your childhood. And for the new people out there, the young people, when I say young, I mean in their 20s, in their 30s, hell, even in their early 40s. A lot of you guys didn't grow up with what I did, so I'm, getting that information out there and locking it down so people in the future and the young people today kind of understand where this all came from and how it came into being. And it's a complicated process. This is basically a big collage of information. I'm going to put out a few other videos talking about more specifics, but I wanted to kind of round it up into one ball for you guys. So if you enjoy my videos, please hit that subscriber button and hit the like button, hit the share button, hit the ding dong and all that stuff. And most importantly, seriously, most importantly, comment. Leave comments. Tell me about your system. Tell me about what kind of power booster you had, electrical tape to the steering wheel shaft underneath the steering wheel, or crammed in an air conditioner vent hole, or because we all did this crazy stuff. We all did it. So just talk about it. Let's talk about that. Let's get that out there. Peace, guys.